You are truly a man who needs no introduction, but I will do introductions anyway. I'm Marta Belcher. I'm special counsel at EFF, general counsel at Protocol Labs, and president of the Filecoin Foundation for the Decentralized Web. More to the point, I am one of the millions of people around the world who were blown away by your disclosures in 2013 that revealed the extent of the US government's illegal warrantless mass surveillance programs. And today I am blown away by your work as the president of the Freedom of the Press Foundation. So I was so thrilled to get to do a fireside chat with you at the Ethereal Summit last May, and I am absolutely delighted to be here almost a year later to follow up on that previous conversation at Ethereal Summit 2022. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. And I'm glad to be able to see you again. I had a lot of fun this last time, so let's do it again.
Yes, I did too. It was so much fun. It's so incredibly cool to get to talk to you about all of these topics. So I guess diving in, over at the FFDW, we are really big fans of the work that you're doing as president at Freedom of the Press Foundation. And we've been so excited to get to support that work. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the things that you're doing as an organization and why that work is so important right now.
One of the things that I think is interesting is you look back in the sort of pre-Freedom of the Press Foundation world and why it was created. And it was because there was a financial blockade being run against WikiLeaks, and they were being cut off from Visa and MasterCard. And what we saw were basically financial sanctions being applied against non-governmental organizations, and in this case, a press organization, for really, I think, the first time in modern history. So this was before I joined, but people were going, can we create some kind of charitable structure that can help avoid setting this precedent where government can get in the way of people's political giving. Now, obviously, it has developed beyond that. We create the secure drop software that's used by all of the most important newsrooms in the world for protected communications with their most sensitive sources. And it's kind of amazing. We can't talk about the successes broadly because the newsrooms don't want to put their people at risk. But stories that have changed history have come through this software. And so that's an amazing thing. We are trying to look at the world as it is. And where we see constraints being applied between the people and the press, right? And basically relax those constraints, create a more free and open society where people can hear the stories that they need and get the information that they need in order to realize a better world.
And you touched on something there that when payment processors cut off financial services for WikiLeaks actually turned to cryptocurrency, right? And when I think about cryptocurrency and civil liberties, I think about how important financial privacy and censorship resistance can really be for dissidents and protesters and whistleblowers. And in fact, just a few months ago, you revealed on Twitter that you used cryptocurrency to pay for the servers that made your revelations possible. So could you talk a little bit about why financial privacy and cryptocurrency are so important for whistleblowers?
I mean, we see this unfortunately happening in the world more and more. There's this question that we all have to ask ourselves. What is the proper role of government in a free and open society? And then we have to look at the role that the government actually plays in the societies that we live in. And then we need to go, are we doing everything we can in order to make the current facts of our reality as they exist today move in the direction of the ideal of what they could and should be? Now, when you sort of wind back the clock to that sort of financial blockade against WikiLeaks, and it's important for people to remember at the time, like a lot of people controversialize WikiLeaks today. But back in 2010, we're talking about the Iraq and Afghanistan war logs, Guantanamo Bay journals, where they were talking about the detainment of people sort of indefinitely. They didn't have access to courts. There were real violations of human rights that were exposed as a result of these disclosures. And it was, they were winning awards from press organizations around the world. But there was a government that obviously resisted this. They felt they were made uncomfortable by it. And so they went, what can we do to stop this, right? And they went, well, if the people who work for WikiLeaks can no longer feed themselves, they might have to find something else to do. Now, the world has really iterated on that design. And, we moved from 2010 to then 2013 era with myself. And I'm going, I wasn't trying to make this completely anonymous. Bitcoin is not a sort of anonymous ledger. It is a truly public ledger, and those things are always out there. There are indelible traces of financial flows. And I knew actually these things could be sort of tied back to me because I wasn't going to enormous lengths to hide them. What I was doing was I was just trying to win time and distance in order to coordinate with the journalists before the moment when I assumed inevitably I would be arrested and sort of thrown in the dark hole and no one would ever hear from me again. The amazing thing is I was able to win enough time and distance that we were able to meet in person. We were able to get the story out. And at the end of the day, we actually succeeded. And we changed the public understanding of what was actually happening. And yeah, cryptocurrency did play a small role in that. There are government types, that would probably hiss at that, which is why I didn't talk about this until years after it happened, when now crypto's already taken over the world. It's really too big to put back in the box. There are still going to be attempts to do so. But, now when we look at today, it's really an open question of, do we see those same dynamics that used to be applied only to organizations and actors that the state perceived as presenting a direct threat to their legitimacy, right? This could impact elections or whatever. Or are we seeing it broadened out and really commercialized, and financial institutions deputized in a real way into basically popularizing the practice of stopping trade without permission. And this is something that I've talked a lot before about. People have lost their understanding broadly because we live comfortable lives or have lived comfortable lives in fairly comfortable times, that liberty, that value we all hold up, but is, kind of abstract. People have difficulty expressing what that is freedom from permission. And we are losing that. We have to click OK to continue. We have to go through all these gates. We have to, deal with click wrap and deplatforming and all of this other stuff. And people go, well, my house, my rules. But the my house, my rules only works when you don't have to be in this place to survive. And what we see today are that the public commons are being gated off and permissioned. And you can't live a normal life in the world as it exists today. You can't survive. You can't get a job. You can't communicate. You can't bank. You can't interact. You simply can't survive without being able to pass through these gates of permission. But if we lose these essential, necessary liberties, if we lose our freedom from permission, if we lose essentially financial liberty, we have really lost liberty in a much more material sense that I think is difficult to unwind.
I could not agree more. And, you said something really interesting there, that cryptocurrency can't be put back in a box. And, during our fireside chat last year, we talked a lot about the importance of cryptocurrency for civil liberties because of its ability to import the anonymity of cash into the online world and its censorship resistance. And over the past year, I've been really alarmed by governments around the world increasingly attempting to impose the mass surveillance of the traditional financial system onto cryptocurrency. So that includes creating new cryptocurrency reporting requirements, increasing warrantless surveillance at choke points, and targeting decentralized exchanges and self-hosted wallets and privacy coins. So what are your thoughts on how this is evolving and why this is so important?
I think governments correctly perceive a evolving threat to traditional tools, which they've grown accustomed to in terms of sort of an ability to impose regulation upon private lives and more broadly private trade, uh, that were never really clearly, I think, accepted or debated in society. They were really more of an imposition that was provided through advances in technology, the same way that mass surveillance in general was imposed upon us, largely secretly or abstractly. Through technical conversations and legal conversations that were intentionally designed to use exclusionary language, right? Like things when a great example is you look at the Federal Reserve Board and their discussions, the kind of language that they use is intentionally meant to only be meaningful to people who follow it, right, exhaustively. And to them, they see the signals, they see the changes in the paragraphs, right? They redline the different statements and they go, okay, here are the signals that are being sent. But to the average person, who doesn't even understand like prime interest rates or something like that, it's gobbledygook, right? And that is an end run around the democratic process. That is an end run around the idea that we have a public that is imposing a meaningful or entering into a bargain in which they grant a meaningful, informed consent to the government for its operations that are then carried out on their behalf. What we've lost is that connection to the operations of our governments. Governments have grown so large and themselves so abstract, so broad that it's assumed no one person can understand all of the sort of different domains that government operates in. And so for the government to shelter itself from criticism for the most impactful policies that it's implementing, and this could be anything. This could be financial, this could be political, this could be technical, this could be environmental, right? They use that bureaucratic language to go, all right, well, maybe we can narrow the conversation by throwing up gates that are not strictly permissioned gates, but they are linguistic gates, right? And what if we narrow the span of people that are able to express any kind of democratic opinion here? And this is actually what leads to this huge sort of misinformation, disinformation environment that we see from the media on both sides today, is we have these interest groups that look at the world as it is and sort of the new policy developments that are being entered. They know that the average Twitter user, Reddit user, whatever, does not have the sophistication to understand what is happening here. And so what they do is they digest those communications or pre-digest them, right? And then they pass that on through sort of a bubbled lens in order to provoke a certain political response from their audiences. And this is done in a very willful, intentional way, in my opinion. And this is what leads to all the partisanship that we've seen, is there is a recognition amongst those who have influence in the world today that the system as it exists today is failing. The political structure as it exists today is failing. And so they want to be able to increase their influence to be able to structure the system that replaces what we have today. And this is all out war because this is, not even a generational question. This is a multi-generational question, who ends up with power to restructure this. And then, as you say, when we come down to this idea of financial flows as they were, where you went down to the corner store and you dropped down your 2 quarters and you came out with a handful of candy or whatever, and the only person who knew it was the shop owner who may have seen this kid come in before, to today where before you even approach the counter, there's some Amazon device or some other business Bluetooth device in the store that's taking a cell phone, a census of cellular radios and sort of Bluetooth identifiers, and trying to cross correlate these things with customer identities. And they go, web traffic on the Wi-Fi. What are the associated tower records that we can purchase from the telecommunications companies? And then when you approach the counter, you pay with your phone or you pay with a card, and these all enter systems that just as our communications were being so sort of aggressively ingested 10 years ago, now it's happening to all financial information today. Now, these kind of information stores and flows were gathered post 9/11, right? But they were, my impression from having worked in the intelligence community and read, a truly staggering amount of our operation reports, cross agency, things like that, is that these were close hold programs. They were largely limited to the Treasury. They were largely limited to groups like the CIA, very specific units in them, using them for very specific things. Again, those information stores were not broadly accessed. We're talking like tens of people in an agency who are using these, and these are in agencies that have tens of thousands of employees. Whereas today, my impression is that this has broadened out. We have kind of cross-agency sharing. We have these agencies collection being enriched by commercial sources of information, which are being purchased in ways that, again, do an end run around the sort of intended limitations that were imposed on agencies when they began these kind of operations, because these commercial sources of data did not previously exist. If you dial back the clock again, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, every dollar bill, right, is serialized. And when you go to very expensive bank machines at very sophisticated banks, and it counts all the bills and whatnot, they might check all of these dollar bill serial numbers in their machine locally to make sure they don't repeat, right? But they weren't particularly networked. Now, all of these machines that you can buy commercially yourself, just for a cash counter at home, have optical character recognition that photographs every bill, like scans every bill very rapidly, because, they're counting hundreds of bills in different spectrums, right? It'll take like a UV shot, an infrared shot, a normal optical shot. And they look at things like the little anti-counterfeiting bands on there. They look for reflectivity to make sure that these are legitimate bills. But they also look at those serial numbers. And actually, in the machine itself, it populates a database of every bill that it is scanned in a format that is designed to be networked and shared to any other ones these have. And I have a suspicion. This has never been sort of publicly established. I'm not even aware of any reporting that's going into this. I may have just missed it. When you think about the way, at least the U.S. Incredibly invasive sort of financial network operates with all of these, anti-money laundering and know your customer impositions, that we have, huge amounts of staff allocated in every bank, or like, risk management or assessment or whatever they want to call it, compliance and so forth. It is hard for me to believe that if they have the technical capacity to, for example, very easily get the serial number of every dollar bill that passes through their hands and send that upstream to the central bank, that they do not. And then, or sort of, when I say central bank, I don't mean the U.S. central bank. I'm not talking about the Federal Reserve, right? I'm talking about the central branch of the bank, these commercial banks, right? And then when you think at their headquarters, whoever is running their department for this kind of stuff, they have a database with all the movements of all the money that they've touched, that they don't cross-reference this with others in their industry, right? And if they're cross-referencing this with others in their industry, it's very likely that they're also sharing this information with the government. And so we have this presupposition that cash is anonymous, that we have inherited from a time when meaningfully it was, that is no longer true, right? And when you think about sort of Bitcoin having a public ledger, well, once a dollar enters the banking system, there is a private ledger that is available to the people who are performing financial surveillance. So it's really just private to the public, but it's public to the prominent, shall we say. And I think this is where a really sort of interesting change is happening with cryptocurrencies that exist today and cryptocurrency with where it's headed. As it is today, these sort of serialized physical currencies are universally tracked and monitored, right? We don't know by who, we don't know by how, but we know the capability is cheap, and we know it's omnipresent. And if it is cheap and omnipresent, someone somewhere is making use of it. But we, the public, cannot benefit from that broadly. We can't see this. We can't do anything like that. Whereas when you look, for example, like on the Bitcoin blockchain, that public ledger is an even playing field. Yes, you get chain analysis people and whatnot who are, doing fairly devious things with it. But you could be doing the same thing with it. We see people using it for, trying to get a financial edge out of the on-chain analysis and things like that for, are these old coins moving or have these been lost or, to make some kind of inferences from that basis. Well, as we improve on the pre-existing systems, as we move to these sort of smart contracts and improvements on the Bitcoin thing, like we've got Zcash and whatnot, we've got Monero. There's Ethereum, which suffers from the same sort of privacy problems as Bitcoin, but then it's also got things like Tornado.cash, which would be wonderful if an Ethereum transaction didn't cost $2,000 dollars every time you want to mint an NFT or something like that. But it just I went kind of on long there. What people are really missing as they get down in the weeds is how transformative the power relationships, or how much the power relationships are going to transform as we move from these legacy technologies to these sort of future decentralized technologies.
Yeah. And what you're saying here about the government surveillance of financial transactions, even potentially with cash, really reminds me of the conversation we had at our last fireside chat about central bank digital currencies. And I think we both used the word terrifying to describe them. We talked about this idea that CBDCs put governments at the center of every transaction and give them the ability to revoke money and absolute visibility into financial transactions. And in October, you wrote an excellent blog post where you said that CBDCs are a perversion of the founding principles of cryptocurrency. I think you called them crypto-fascist currencies. Yeah. And, a lot has, which I loved. And a lot has really happened in recent months. So what's your take on where this is headed and what the risk is if we get this wrong?
I mean, the risk is very easy to illustrate. If you remember cartoons, like the DuckTales Scrooge McDuck, there's one guy who's got a giant vault full of coins and dollar bills and things like that. And if he needs money, like a giant magnet comes out of the top of it and it just pulls dollars out of everybody in the town's pockets. That is what a CBDC is, right? And that's really all it is. What I mean by a crypto-fascist currency is we don't realize that we have immediately been subordinated and collectivized to the central actor in the economy. The dollar is that today in its electronic form. But the cash sort of physical legacy form of it, while it does have all of these sort of limitations that I mentioned as it enters sort of the complex financial system, when you go down to McDonald's, right, who knows, actually, McDonald's is a little too sophisticated these days. Maybe I shouldn't use that example. When you go down to the bodega, right, or the deli, and you buy a ham and cheese, the guy who presses the button on the register that's been there since 1975, and, the till pops out and he puts the dollar in and gives you another dollar back, that still works regardless of what the government is interested in. As we move towards increasingly electronic versions of cash, and we are using electronics and electronic platforms and electronic accounts and centralized services, those permissioning gates that I mentioned before, our freedom from permission becomes ever more finite and ever more limited. And increasingly, we're being asked to step more through these gates. And that is a tremendous concern.
Yeah, my uncle still uses a typewriter in his office, and I think your revelations really empowered him and made him feel like that was the right call.
Well, I hope he knows that
Um,
the typewriter ribbon itself keeps a record of everything, that every character that he's punched through it. That's how we used to do espionage back in the day. Was we would send in typewriter service guys into the embassy, and they would take the ribbons out, and then you unfurl the ribbon, and you see where all the keys had landed on it.
Oh, that's really interesting. I'll pass that along.
Yeah.
Um, so in your blog post about CBDCs, you also talked a little bit about the history of money and compared cryptocurrency to traditional banks, which you said are parasitic and inefficient and prey on customers with impunity. And I was really struck by something you said in that blog post, which was that there's almost nothing a bank can do to provide access to and protect your assets that an algorithm can't replicate and improve upon. And I've also heard you talk in other forums about the idea that government currency may not exist in the same way in the future. And so I would love to hear what you think the future of money looks like if we get it right.
Well, I'm not sure if we get it right, because I don't want to go sort of beyond my lane here. There are people who have more experience and better thinking in this area. But briefly, I think this is what we see the explosive interest in decentralized finance is all about. It is the fundamental recognition that the purposes that made banks attractive, back in the frontier days, um, are really no longer necessary. And now banks are legacy institutions that are deputized by governments and by central banks, right? Um, to basically extract a piece of every dollar in exchange for furthering the interests of this sort of financial political class, that interaction there. And that doesn't really do the world or the public broadly any good. There are, sort of Keynesian types out there who would go, we want to adjust the currency for the business cycle. But when we look at the world today, in the absence of sort of a non-interventionist financial policy, is it really clear that it's succeeding, or has it actually made things worse? Has sort of the infinite credit problem, I would say, sort of incentivized consumerism and materialism to an extent that it has caused rampant environmental harm, and ultimately really created the kind of world-shaking military conflicts that have begun. Even when you look, nation on nation, not in the current moment, about 20 years, you look at very poor countries that are very unstable countries, and they're beginning to have civilizational conflicts with very rich, very far away countries because of that kind of extractive relationship where, the monetary policies of a country that's very far away don't just affect the people who live in that country, they affect the entire world, right? And what if we had a more fair, more level system where we couldn't have quite these same levels of interference, except for those who opt into that, right? Who say that I want to use a system that does that kind of thing. And they could, right? And now we see a free and fair competition, which will really call into question the economic sort of religious tenets that we have inherited from sort of this legacy system. And I think in terms of getting it right, there's basically only one thing that we need to do, which is we need to nail private trade, right? Somebody should be able to send something to anyone for anything. And that shouldn't be something that we can interfere with. That shouldn't be something, the government of Canada or whatever can say, we're going to cut this off. Because if we do that, everybody's going to start doing it. And that's not supposition. We already see it happening. The idea that Canada, of all places, would do this, and I think most people see Canada as a pretty enlightened government, is really an illustration of the concern. Whether you're for or against this particular protest or this particular protest movement is really secondary to the problem that, at the flip of a switch, we are vulnerable to being unable to sort of take anything out of our wallet. That giant magnet pops out of the top of the building, and now, these people aren't wearing any clothes. Everything else follows from that. Now, there are people who will talk about, like from the government side, well, we've got investigative interests and things like that. And yeah, sure, that's fine. But we have traditional means of law enforcement and investigating people that have been effective and will be effective regardless of the technologies involved, right? Because we have this digital layer on our lives, but we also have the physical layer, right? And when you've got a corrupt oligarch somewhere, who's trying to launder money to buy a $500 billion Bezos class or the next Bezos class yacht, that physically exists somewhere. People physically exist somewhere. They put it together, and then the yacht goes somewhere. And these are all things that can be gotten. These are all things that can be investigated, right? And that is the layer where sort of regulation should be occurring. Because if we're not doing that, what we're doing is we're imposing a pre-criminal investigation. When we start talking about things like pre-crime, that's where we really move into the darkest corners of dystopia.
I completely agree. And I was similarly completely shocked, over the past few weeks by the government of Canada's response to protests, to proactively to require financial institutions to proactively freeze accounts of protesters or anyone supporting protesters, right? So financial institutions were required to freeze protesters' accounts, even if they hadn't done anything illegal. And I was very glad to see the Canadian Civil Liberties Association challenge that in court. But, that's sort of financial censorship by the government. In the US, there is court precedent that if a government official asks payment processors to cut off financial services to a business for engaging in protected speech, that does violate the First Amendment. And we're very lucky to have those protections in the US. But, one of the things I think people don't really realize is, well, outside of government actors doing that, actually all the time, financial institutions will, of their own accord, cut off access to financial services for perfectly legal businesses because some bank executive finds something objectionable.
Right.
So like one
PayPal is a classic example of this. They're terrible on it.
Exactly. And you've seen, PayPal and other payment processors cutting off booksellers and social networks and video websites and whistleblower websites. And recently, one really high profile example was basically payment processors threatening to cut off OnlyFans unless they censored explicit content, even when that content is perfectly legal. And, as we've said, really when you're cut off from those types of payments, it's something that can absolutely kill your business unless you can really turn to cryptocurrency, which is one of the reasons that it's so important that cryptocurrency is censorship resistant. So, what are your thoughts on this sort of private financial censorship?
Yeah, I think the idea here is we don't have any guarantees of economic freedom in the system as it exists today. And that should really be chilling when we look now at the technological capabilities that are being developed to intermediate our sort of economic interactions when we look at those permissioning gates that are being sort of built and stood up everywhere. Because a gate of silicon is actually much, much stronger than a gate of stone. And what we need to be prepared for is this idea that government is not going to reform itself. It's not going to get better. No one ever gifts you a better world. It has to be fought for and won. Hopefully, those are political battles. That's always what we want. Violence isn't the answer, as it's sort of famously said. But This is really interesting when we start talking about sort of math and economy, because this is fundamentally a an abstract interaction. Even our money, right? That's a token. It's an abstract representation of a unit of value. And what if we can answer the question not so much with sort of politics or interaction there, but with math, right? We solve a math problem with math instead of trying to solve a math problem with politics, solve a math problem with law. And that is tremendously subversive, but I think also tremendously powerful. What if we could guarantee economic freedom instantly, right? By standing up a system somewhere to anyone, anywhere who can connect to it, who can access it. And that can be, writing in your phone or whatever. And I think that is possible. We've already established that with sort of private cryptocurrencies that do have shielded transactions. And that's the direction I think that it needs to go. When we look at, as you say, these private institutions interfering, the reason they do it is because they can, and because someone somewhere will know if they don't, right? We have all of these people with access to their economic histories because of the many layers of regulation that have been imposed on these systems that are really all duct tape and, bubble gum stuck together to try to make this system limp along a little bit further. But should they? And if nobody could sort of view this ledger of all their activities, would they? It's not really in their economic interest to do so. It's not really in the public interest to do so. It is in the governmental interest to do so, but is the private interest aligned with the governmental interest? At times in history, yes. At other times, no. And so I think there's an opportunity here when we look at, for example, what happened in this Canadian case. The government did something, and these crowdfunding websites went up to try to oppose it. Government didn't like that, so they applied a new and unprecedented sort of regulatory layer on it to start going, we're going to cut these guys out of the system. In tandem with this, we saw targeted leaks of like donor lists for all of these people, which had, their names and their emails or whatever. I didn't actually look at it, so I don't know the particular rows and, the SQL table here. But then you've got journalists that are like chasing down grandma who donated, $14.55 to, some person that she's never met just because she saw it on TV and thought it was a cause that she believed in. Right or wrong, again, people should be able to support political causes that are dear to them. Even if you think this is terrible, it's, Al-Qaeda or something. If you can't do it for the cases that you disagree with, governments can separate you from giving to cases that you do agree with. The only way to avoid this kind of malpractice is to avoid the